to the IGC's session on minding the gap, so scaling women micro enterprises. And my name is Sandra Sequeira. I'm professor of development economics here at the School of Public Policy at the LSE. I've been working with the IGC for about 16 years now, mostly as a lead academic for one of the country programs in Mozambique. And so today we're here, and I thank you for coming, given how beautiful it is outside, and we're in a windowless room, but hopefully the conversation will make up for that. So the theme for International Women's Day on the 8th of March this year was to try to dismantle what are still critical structural barriers for women and girls to have access, equal access to justice and to rights. Now, a lot of progress has been made. There's been some backsliding in recent political environment worldwide, but a lot still needs to be done. So the IGC has been working at the forefront of some of these key questions on how to reduce gender inequality by trying to provide frontier research findings that are actionable for governments to try to improve access to justice and rights. So what we will have today, we will start by having the head of our Trade and Firms program, Rania Nasir, who is going to introduce us a brief that will summarize some of the most impactful and most sometimes puzzling results of what have been 10 years of research on this topic. So Rania will talk to us for about 20 minutes, and then we'll invite our distinguished panelists for a broader discussion. So I would just ask you to save some of your questions. I think Rania will have some elements of interaction during the discussion, but to save your questions for after we finish our conversation with the panelists at the end, we'll have a dedicated Q&A for about 20 minutes. Thanks so much, and Rania, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Sandra. Okay, great. So I'm supposed to speak for 20 minutes, but I hate the sound of my own voice, so we're going to make this interactive. So whip out your phones, scan the QR code, and we'll take it from there. So when we are thinking about women entrepreneurship and the gap between men and women in entrepreneurship, I think the first basic question you ask yourself is there even a gap? If yes, how big is it? And unfortunately, there is a gap. So I think that's pretty obvious. But if you disaggregate the number of female-owned enterprises by the size of the firm, you can see that as firms increase in size, the number of women in leadership positions or the number of women who own these enterprises decreases. So there's an element of there are not enough women-owned enterprises, which is obvious because you can see it's 24% of all enterprises are women-owned, formal enterprises. So, okay, we've established that there's a gap, but let's talk about the women-owned enterprises that do exist. Let's not think about the imaginary ones. The enterprises that are currently that exist, what do they look like? How do they compare to male-owned enterprises? So let's unpack this a little bit. The first question is are they more profitable than male-owned enterprises? The answer is no. So women-owned enterprises, and forgive the unfortunate acronym, report lower profits in similar sectors, and this is a study done in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, so these enterprises don't generate profits, but are they at least productive? The answer is no. So they are less productive than male-owned enterprises, between 5 to 7%, and it's a study done with 30 countries in the global south. Okay, so we know they're not profitable. We know they're not as productive. What do the survival rates look like? The answer is not great. So they tend to close at higher rates in comparison to male-owned enterprises. And this is a study in the US. The reason we picked that is it's incredibly difficult for us to map enterprises that close in the global south. So if anything, the gap's likely to be larger. So that begs the question is, should we mind the gap? So pull out your phones and tell me, do we even need more women in this space, given how they're performing? And there's no judgment. It's anonymous, so if you say no, it's fine. Okay, so definitely yes. Seems like I was hoping for at least some rebels out there, but no. Okay, so let's talk. You've now said that you think that there is a space for them. Now I'm gonna ask you, why do you think it's important for them to be there? So put down the answers as to why you think it's important. Part of this is me being cheeky, because rather than me convincing you that it's important to have women-owned enterprises, I'm getting you to do the work. Okay, diversity is one of the reasons. Okay. Power, that's interesting. Good, good. Equal distribution, empowerment, diversification. Very different perspectives. So scroll down a bit. Okay, here we go. Okay, so you have a couple of reasons. These are mine because I decided not to be as lazy. These aren't a comprehensive list. These are just the ones that I find interesting. The first one is innovation. So what are the ideas that we're missing out on because we don't have women-owned enterprises? And there was a study that was done in the US where they looked at the invention rates, the innovation rates, and they modeled it, and they essentially said that if women, minorities, people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds created inventions at the same rate as rich white men, the income in the US would quadruple. So if the income in the US would quadruple, and it's a relatively more gendered, equitable society, heavy emphasis on the relatively, because who knows how it's going. But the idea is that if that's the case in the US, what does it look like for countries in the global south, where the gap is way wider? The second element is misallocation of resources. I think this is pretty self-explanatory, so I'm going to skim over it. The last one is one that I'm particularly interested in. So women's labor market participation. It's probably very obvious that women tend to hire more women. What's not obvious is that women tend to hire more women at a much higher rate. So if you disaggregate the data and you look at male-owned firms versus female-owned firms, male-owned firms have around 20% of their workforce are women. And out of that 22%, it's only a minority which get promoted into top manager positions. In contrast, if you look at female-owned firms, around 40% of female-owned firms have workforce which are women. And this is my favorite part, it's over 50%, the likelihood of a woman being in a management position in these firms. So it matters for the labor force as well. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about how big the gap is. We've talked a little bit about how women enterprises don't perform that well. We've talked about why it's important to support them, but how do we support them? So what we're going to do is we're going to go over the full arc of what entrepreneurs need to be successful and growth oriented. So the first element that they need is firm capabilities. Essentially, entrepreneurs need to have good ideas, so innovation. They need to have good management practices, and they need to have strong entrepreneurial skills. One project at the IGC is looking at this in Ghana. So what we're looking at is women entrepreneurs in Ghana have smaller and less diverse networks. And these networks are more about their friends and family, they tend to be more women, they tend to be informal. And part of it is because there is an education gap. And part of it is also because a lot of these women operate their businesses from their home, so it just makes more sense. The problem with these less diverse networks is that it limits peer learning, and that stifles growth. Now, what the researchers did is they created two buckets. They got a bunch of entrepreneurs, I think it was 1,700. And the first bucket is that they clustered them into online networking groups. So they had groups of 8 people who were in similar industries, and they got them to talk to each other at least one time a week. For the other bucket, what they did is that they had the same, so they had online networking groups, they created these clusters, but they also provided legal support. So what did that lead to? There was an improvement in business practices. Business innovation also increased by 25 to 31%. And now this is where I'm going to ask you guys for your input. So I'm going to ask you guys to guess. And there are no wrong answers. The only wrong answer is not trying to guess. I'm going to ask you whether different metrics increased, decreased, or stayed the same. And I want you to raise your hands. So with regards to profits, who are the people who feel like profits increased as a result of this intervention? We have 1 hand, 2 hands, a couple. Okay, who feels profits decreased? Okay, 5. And who feel profits stayed the same? Okay, a couple of hands. So they went up by 21%. Now let's come to sales. Who thinks sales increased? Okay, several people in the room. Who think they decreased? And who thinks they stayed the same? A couple. So the ones who said they stayed the same are right. Essentially, there was no effect on sales. So what does this mean? This means that these businesses were able to reduce their costs, which goes back to the business practices and cost reduction strategies that the women were talking about in their teams. And another, I spoiled this for you, but basically, legal support had no impact. So there was no advantage, there was no specific advantage of having legal support and creating a small cluster of women and not. Now, what are the mechanisms that cause this? So my initial prior was that you're creating clusters of women, you're just going to have more collaborations, you're just going to expand the number of collaborations. But that's not what happened. What happened is women moved away from their small, informal, family-oriented networks, and they moved towards using the WhatsApp groups and using their peers that they were put in touch with and relying on them. The second element is that peer effects mattered greatly. So if you were put in a group that was filled with other firms that were doing way better at baseline, so they had better sales, they had better profits, they had better business practices, you're more likely to be doing better in comparison to your counterparts. The last one is the bit that I really like, is if you were put in a group of women in the same industry, the impact of that intervention was less than if you were put in a group with different industries. So often we talk about, you need to have learning and learn from each other who are having similar struggles. In this case, diversity of voices and diversity of experiences matters. Okay, great. So you are the best, entrepreneur to exist on the face of the planet, but having ideas isn't everything. You need access to input. So this is where you get capital, raw materials, labor. So you need to have access to things to be able to make your goods and services. So for this one, I'm going to focus primarily on capital because there's a lot of discourse about the gap, the finance gap that women and entrepreneurs face. And the idea is that there's I think IFC put in a study that it's around $1 trillion. I have it in my notes somewhere, so if somebody wants to ask me later, you can. But the gap is pretty significant. And what is the intervention we're looking at? We're now moving to Kenya. So in Kenya, below 15% of venture-backed startups have women founders. And because they're not able to access capital, it stifles their growth. Now, part of the reason why I chose this intervention is because a lot of the studies that talk about the gap in capital put the onus on the firm. It's how to get the firm to be more investment ready, how to get the firm to pitch itself well. And the idea with this intervention is, let's focus on the investors. What do investors do, and how could we improve that to close the gap? So as they were studying it, they found that when investors set up these meetings to talk to firms, they realized that with women, they tend to ask questions regarding risk. With men, they tend to ask questions regarding forecast, growth potential, etc. So inherently, there's already a bias in the topics that you're thinking about. What they did is they encouraged them to use a systematic evaluation framework. The idea is that gender agnostic, you ask all entrepreneurs that you're interviewing both questions about risk and reward. So what happened? They assessed startups more consistently and they assessed them more dynamically. Now, what do you think the result of this was? Do you think people who think it increased the gender gap, so it made it worse, raise your hands. People who think it stayed the same. Okay, a couple. People who think the gender gap decreased. Okay, well, majority of you are right. But it happened at a very large scale. So in some cases, it reversed the gender gap in investment outcomes. And this is incredibly fascinating because all you did is create an evaluation framework. It's not that expensive. So what are the policy implications with this? Creating context-specific evaluation frameworks are so important, and this is where DFIs and governments have a role to play, where you can train investors, accelerators, fund managers on frameworks. And it's also a pretty cheap intervention. If you think about the number of interventions that go on about fixing capital gaps through subsidies, etc., they're incredibly costly. Okay, great. So you're an amazing entrepreneur. You have limitless input. You've created the best product. It means nothing if you don't have access to your clientele. You don't have links to the market. And historically, women tend to be in markets that export less and are less connected. So we're now heading to Tunisia, where it's exactly the same scenario, where women are less likely to export and they're not as well integrated in global value chains. And what does that do? If you can't sell your product, expanding your firm becomes incredibly difficult. What did the researchers do? They encouraged the formation of export consortiums. So they created clusters in different industries, and they essentially they ensure that there are no competitors within each cluster. So this is a callback to the previous paper. And they got them to consolidate and share resources in order to be able to export, whether that's going to trade fairs, setting up a website, hiring someone to do operations, etc. Okay, so this is, which one am I going to do? Okay, so the intervention worked. 63% were more likely to export. Now, I would like to see your hands on what you expect with sales. People who expect sales to increase, raise your hands. People who expect sales to decrease. And no change. Okay, a couple. Sales went up, they doubled. What are your expectations with profit? Do you expect profits to increase? Yeah, a couple. Decrease? Stay the same? Okay, the ones who said that they stay the same are right. there was no effect on profit. So this is either the result was slightly noisy because it might take longer for profit to come up, or it might be more expensive for them to start developing these networks to export, setting up their systems to do that. And they went back 2 years later, so maybe it takes longer for profits to translate. Another interesting thing is that although a lot of women were invited, only 50% joined. And part of the reason that is that coordination costs increase significantly. It's essentially several different enterprises who are all trying to coordinate to push their markets to export. The policy implication for this is it's a cost-effective, scalable means to share investment costs, because essentially women-owned enterprises are smaller, they have less capital, they have less resources, and they're competing against men-owned enterprises which are bigger, which have a lot more resources, a lot more networks, a lot more access. So the idea is if you get them to cluster and combine, a little bit how unions work, but they're more able to compete against men. Okay, so you have the best, you're the best entrepreneur in the world, you have all the access to inputs, you have all the market linkages. All of this doesn't mean much if your enabling environment is not conducive. So this includes government support, laws, regulations, daycare, etc. There was a World Bank report which said that 101 out of 190 countries, women face at least one legal constraint that prevented them from operating a business in comparison to men. So 101 is a lot. And there are around 53% of economies that do not have laws prohibiting gender discrimination and access to credit. So there's still a lot of way to go there. The last thing I'd like to say is, what does this all mean? So part of my reflection with this is, honestly, research can do better, because previously we used to, the way it would work is we have an intervention, throw it into the market, and then if we wanted to see the impact of men and women differentially, you gender disaggregate the data and you see the difference in impact. But we're comparing apples to oranges. The constraints that women face are very, very, very different to what men face. So it's not comparable. Another element that I was interested in is we need to customize the way we do research. So a lot of the facts that I showed you are pretty dismal, but perhaps we're not measuring things properly. So there was this one paper that looked at microenterprises, women-led microenterprises, and they couldn't see them have a profit. And they really delved into it, and they went quite granular. And what they realized is women were making money, but they were passing it on to their partners. And all the income was reinvested into the men's business. But because researchers were focusing primarily on the women's business and asking 500 questions about the women's business, the impact missed out. So if we would have just expanded it at the household level, you would have been able to see the impact of the marketing. Last question for you guys is, what would you like us to do more research on? Because this is a very hot topic, well, especially this week. But the idea is, what are the elements that you need more research on? And if there's some that I feel like we already have some research on, I'll connect you to my team and we can look at it later. But yeah, I'm going to leave this live because I think we're also out of time, and then we can pass it on. Yeah, but thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Franny, for that excellent introduction. I would next invite the distinguished panelists to come up to the podium. Thank you. Well, thanks again, Rania, for that excellent overview. And so the goal now is to continue this conversation, this discussion about how to unlock this potential for female-led micro enterprises and how this can then also remove barriers to growth and development. So to help me in this conversation, we have an excellent panel of experts with us today. So we have Diva Dar, who is Deputy Director of the Women's Economic Empowerment at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We have Adriansola Adio-Adupodju, welcome, founder and CEO of iTrain Africa, Skilled for Work Academy. We have Claire Innes, who is the Head of Financial Inclusion at EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And we have... I
think the EBRD, that would be me.
Oh, apologies. I skipped one line. I skipped one line. Okay, FCDO. Yes, we should know that. Okay, so Claire Innes, welcome again as Deputy Director of the Growth Directorate at FCDO. And finally, Dana, last but not least, Dana Kupova, the Head of Financial Inclusion at the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So just a reminder, we would ask you to please keep your questions for the end of our discussion. We're going to have a discussion of approximately 45 minutes, and then we might have 15 minutes in the end for an open Q&A. So I wanted to start picking up on some of the dismal statistics that Rania introduced in the beginning of how female-led micro enterprises tend to, first of all, they're fewer in number, but they also have much lower survival rates. So the common reaction to this type of scenario has been to try to fix women. So there's something about we need to make them more of risk takers. We need to get them to scale faster, to go into more into different sectors. How much of it is it about fixing women as opposed to just thinking about all the other obstacles and barriers in the system that prevent them to get ahead with their businesses? So perhaps we could start here with Divan.
Yeah, no, sure. Rania, thanks for a great presentation. I think you did most of our work for us already, but happy to say a little bit more about what I think are endowment effects and others that are structural effects and barriers that could really help promote women's entrepreneurship. I think there are a number of things that we didn't necessarily get into, which is that women come into entrepreneurs, even their starting point is not equal to men. So they don't have the same levels of education, the same levels of skills, the same networks. So they're endowed with, lower assets to really start off with in the first place. And that is partly systemic and normative as well. So I'm not saying that it's the woman who needs to get fixed, but they're already entering the entrepreneurship game at a disadvantage. And so I think, it's not just about women as entrepreneurs. We do need to fix the system from the get-go in terms of the broader enabling environment, as Rania put it very nicely. So the laws, the education and skill set that they're getting, the norms that they're facing. And then I think we get to the broader question around the structural barriers. So points that we already touched on in terms of access to capital, access to care, access to markets, which I think are going to be so critical in terms of actually changing the barriers or the system that women face. So just to give you an example, most women are going to get discriminated against when they apply for loans. It's been sort of studied widely, whether it's in terms of fake profiles, where everything is held equal and it's just a gender that's varied. It's now been studied sort of across the board in terms of real outcomes as well. And so there is an issue in terms of systemic discrimination from those who are deciding where the capital is allocated. But it's also a situation of thinking about other constraints that they're coming in with in terms of collateral, in terms of the assets that they have. And we need to, I would say one of the other things where I feel like there's a frontier research is we've written off microfinance a while ago in terms of its potential to actually enable women's enterprises. And I do think that traditional microfinance may not be best suited, but I do think the innovations that are coming around in terms of collateralized finance, in terms of flexible loan products, in terms of actually thinking about repayment periods, really designing customized products for women and for their lives, show a lot of potential in terms of actually boosting women's entrepreneurship. And I think this is one of the sort of areas of work that the foundation has been supporting over the last few years. And it will soon be launching the Africa Women's Enterprise Fund, which is really meant to, support impact first lenders in terms of actually getting credit out to women at better rates. So there's an issue with sort of the product level, and there's also an issue in terms of, what is the cost of credit to lenders. The other thing that I'm going to pass on soon is, given there are a lot of researchers in this room, I think there's a lot of work on the data side that does need to be fixed. And I don't just mean evaluations of programs, I mean actually understanding women's enterprises. So the graphs you saw today that Vanya was presenting were all women who have more than 5 employees. But 95% of women have less than 5 employees. So they're really sitting with 0 or 1 employees. It's your woman who's selling vegetables in her free time. She's mending clothes. These are not the typical sort of entrepreneurs you see on TV or sort of the VC ventures are not your typical female entrepreneurs. And they're usually working fewer hours than their male counterparts as well. So they're not as visible. They're mostly household based. They're not in like a physical location that's outside of the house, which means most enterprise surveys don't actually capture them. And most household surveys who are not looking for enterprises miss these women as well. So really, we don't really know anything about women's enterprises very well in most of our countries. There's a lot of work to be done in terms of actually better understanding characteristics of female enterprises and entrepreneurs. One of the things we're doing is we're supporting the ILO and the World Bank to work with some of the research Vanya mentioned with Morgan Hardy and Gisela Kagi to actually get some of these measures into large-scale surveys, which are household or labor force surveys that do cover every household and representative. So women's businesses don't go missing and you can actually understand them better. And then I think there's a lot more to do on the sort of data side of capital and other things, but more for later.
Right. Thank you, Diva. So, Dana, is it fixing women or fixing the system around them, or a bit of both?
Oh gosh, we don't have as much time as we should have for this discussion. I think that the issue is, of course, multifaceted. So women-led enterprises, they very often don't have access to networks. They don't have access to very often to the right skill. They might have the care burden. So there is a lot of stuff that makes it more problematic for women-led businesses. And that's the case across the board. I would probably build on what Diva was saying about the data, because I think that's the most fundamental and first thing that has to be addressed for us. At EBRD, we have been implementing Women in Business program for the past 15 years or 13 years. The focus of the program is to support women entrepreneurs in getting better access to finance, better access to skills, build their business, sustain their business, and grow their business. We started the program in Turkey, and I think that back then it was more like intuitive. People thought, okay, so we have all these financial instruments, but we don't see women-led businesses anywhere. Where are they? How can we attract them? And we started building this product. We now reached more than 250,000 of women-led SMEs across our region with skills building programs, with networking, with financing. But every time the conversation with the financial institutions comes back to, yes, but we don't know what is actually happening at the market level. Are we already, we don't have biases in our systems. So we assume that, if in our system we have 10% women-led businesses, there are probably that many businesses in the market. Yeah. So what we started looking at jointly actually was the WeFinance initiative is how we can unlock the data in different markets. And we are now rolling out in 14 countries the WeFinance code. We are rolling this out through regulators, because the regulators have a natural authority in the market. If the regulator asks for the data, you better provide the data, and it better be good quality data. And we are starting to see really interesting statistics coming out of this. Yeah. It's confirming what we knew all along, but what was sort of hidden in anecdotal evidence that everybody would question, yeah, but our market is different. So in most of the countries, what we see is, okay, women-led businesses in the SME space stand for about 30% of the overall SME portfolio. And in most of the countries, the sort of access to credit would be somewhere between 8% of the overall credit to maybe in some of the better performing, it might be 17%, for example. So the gap is evidently there. And we also look at non-performing loans. And again, very similar story in most of the countries. You know, the most recent one I was looking at had NPL ratio of about 2.3 for all SMEs. For women-led businesses, it was 0.9. So the gap is massive. So ultimately, if I translate it, women get less money with worse conditions, and they repay better. Yeah, and this is something that we see sort of in most of these markets, and it is an eye opener, because if the data is collected centrally by the regulator, there is a lot less questions about, okay, so, you know, is this good quality data? No, it's a data which were submitted to the regulator. So there is not much discussion about that. So I know that WeFinance Code Initiative is implementing this across many more countries. I think it's more than 30 now. At EBRD, we are doing this in 14 countries, including, for example, in Ukraine. We are covering Central Asia, we are covering Western Balkans, and also Morocco and Egypt. There is a lot of traction and interest among financial institutions to participate, because they can see that there is a business opportunity. The data that we are getting from the initiative are actually really granular in some of the countries. So it allows the banks to get a snapshot of the overall market in terms of which sector are women-led businesses in, which region, what is the size. So it gives a lot of information, useful market information, which will be in the future used to actually design proper products. And they could be different for different financial institutions, because one might be more active in one sector than another. And I think that on the topic of access to finance and what needs to be fixed, and on the access to finance, there is one more thing that I wanted to mention, and it's only because it's really fresh in my mind. I went to Turkey last week, where we have a very large green facility to support green investments. And I must say, when it comes to green finance and climate resilience, women-led businesses are for them, it's a perfect storm, if I can use the analogy, because these businesses very often operate in sectors which have low margin, they have reduced access to capital, and it really reduces their ability to prepare for climate change. So all of these disruptions are actually going to have, I think, very negative impact, especially on women-led businesses. So we need to fix this. And I think for us, the data has been really unlocking a lot of useful conversations.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Dana. So the importance of data to better
Yes.
understand whether it is fixing women or the system. Adrian Solem, your views as well?
Yeah, thank you very much. And, you know, when she was talking about data, one thing that came to my mind was when she said, something I always say is there's one major problem we have, especially in Africa, is lack of data. So when Rania was talking and she was saying something like, oh, this is the data we have, I said, oh, I know that, right? Because you can't even scale what you don't measure, right? So let's start from, I'm a founder, right? I'm the founder of an educational technology startup. Now, I look at it most of the time when we are talking about, should we fix women, should we fix systems? from my perspective, and from talking from the African perspective, I feel like first we need to even fix women, because there are three major issues that affect African founders that are women. I'll say first is the woman herself in terms of mindset and visibility. An African founder who is a woman, they have that thing of when they're starting a business or initiatives that come, it's about starting the business, not about scaling the business. And naturally, when you groom a woman in Africa, it's like, oh, even if you're starting a business, it's just to support yourself, not to scale it. So it's in terms of when you have that mindset towards the business, you take less risk because you are not trying to save the world. You're not trying to build a conglomerate. You are just trying to get back. So it means that if you don't fix the mindset of that woman, forget the amount of capital you bring into that business. They are not trying to scale it. And I'm talking about this from a personal, I've been an entrepreneur for 16 years. And my very first business, a fashion business, I ran it for 9 years. Profits good, revenue good. But guess what? Until it took, like, there was a particular program that the IFC did in Nigeria in partnership with Access Bank, and they call it a Womenpreneur Page Tour. And they got us into that room. And for the first time, I saw, like, wow, like, I didn't realize I was building a business that wasn't going to scale. And that was the time that I started to think about it, like, okay, if, and by the way, I have a PhD in chemistry, with my level of education, if I wasn't thinking about scaling that business, what happens to that woman in the village, right? So it is about fixing the mindset. And that program, that was in 2019, changed everything for me. iTrain Africa started in 2020. So me going into iTrain Africa, I went with the mindset of I needed to build systems that would scale, as in from the word get-go. So the decisions you make, the kind of solutions you build it from the point of can it scale? Because I then had that training in 2019. So it technically changed my mindset around. So when I say fix the woman, I say, trust me, you need to actually fix the mindset. Another thing regarding mindset is about visibility. I always say funders are not going to give you money if they cannot monitor your activities online. You don't look like the person they are going to fund. And you see a lot of African women, there's a particular program we run at iTrain Africa, where we teach women how to actually build visibility so that they can then use it to advance their businesses and all that. And you're talking to a woman and she's saying, Dr. AAA, like, I think it's vanity to put myself out there. And I'm like, hello? Do you realize that visibility is actually like an infrastructure for you to scale? No one is going to support you if you don't have that visibility. It's an infrastructure, it's not vanity. So you have to constantly convince a woman to actually even show up to, like, and these are people that are doing big numbers. You see them doing big numbers that when I look at them, I'm like, if we just take this number and just put it out on LinkedIn, put out the right things, you're going to find funding, partnership. But no, they are not even interested because, again, mindset of it's vanity. So that is one element, the mindset, that needs to be fixed. Now, most of the time when people then talk about capital, that's a different conversation. Capital, there was a report I was reading from the Global Entrepreneurship Metric a couple of days ago, and it said 40% of founders in Africa are women, and it's the largest in the world. 40%. Now, if founders have 40%, but the question is, guess what? There's another report that then says last year, 2025, guess what's the percentage of funding that went to women? 0.9. So you have 40% founders, but 0.9% of funding went to 40%. So technically, like about 32 billion or thereabouts went to funding. So only 28 million went to women-owned businesses. So again, it brings the question, if you ever go to a pitch-a-thon, something, and a woman is pitching, the first thing you say, people check you out online, they check out all your this thing. You don't have books, you don't have presence online, nothing. So you are already at a disadvantage. So when people are saying, oh, they are not funding women-owned business, let's be honest, if I was on the panel and I was about to put my money in something, I want to check out that the founder actually knows what they are doing. So it's about, have we trained the leader, have we trained the woman to know what is required to actually access that funding. Because if we don't, we'll keep having 1%, like on the long run. Then the third thing is, which is where we actually work in terms of the workforce, the capabilities. It is so difficult to find competent people to scale your business. And I know this firsthand. When I exited academia to say, oh, we need to build workplace skills, curriculum, I was ready to build the curriculum. But the very first challenge I had was finding the person that will work with me to build the curriculum. So I would say I would try to recruit, because then the EdTech was just kind of, emerging in Africa. Thanks to COVID, it hastened the process. And I'm like, can I just find someone who is at least have digital literacy to at least run this EdTech with me? I couldn't find one. So it meant that I first needed to build the capability of whoever I recruit to run the business with me. And that is the pain of most African startups, especially owned by women. So we are not suffering from women starting businesses, but ask the question, how many of those businesses are scaling? And if you don't scale, you cannot actually impact the economic growth of that country. So in fact, when Diva was talking, Dana Diva, right, was talking, and I said, it's important that even in our interventions, we need to allocate a percentage to growth phase businesses, because most of this funding comes to micro. And at the micro level, the economy is not going to change. And that's, I'm really grateful. Like last year, iTrain Africa got selected at MasterCard Foundation EdTech Fellowship that came with a $100,000 USD grant and advisory. They were very focused on growth stage businesses, because that is where you can then take them from here to here, which is what also that first program did for me. Growth stage businesses, a percentage must be allocated, not just say, oh, we have 10 billion. 10 billion of the 10 billion, how much, what's the percentage that is going to scaling businesses, women-owned businesses? Thank you.
Excellent, thanks so much. Claire, is this mindset just a problem of African female micro-entrepreneurs, or is it more universal than that?
It's universal, I think, and going last in true civil servant fashion, I think I agree with all the panelists, and in terms of the approach that we need, because it's a complex. So it is about the individual, but it is about the systemic barriers and constraints that we see. But just before I go into that, I think it's about the why as well, and Adiri was just touching on that. So I think if you look globally, if you had full female economic participation, it could add $6 trillion to the global economy. In developing countries, it could add around 23 increased GDP output by 23%. So we're not doing this because it's not only just to empower women. This is about supporting global productivity, and it's about driving development. And it is about creating firms that can grow and can scale and can create jobs that then boost incomes and help us, from my perspective, heading up an economic development department, reduce poverty and accelerate progress to the SDGs. So I think it's really important to remember that one of these drivers, and the importance of getting this right, it's not just a nice to have. This is absolutely essential on the impact that it can have. And I think colleagues have really covered this off really well. There are a set of systemic, and I won't repeat them, but the financing gap is $1.76 trillion. That was covered. We're hearing why that is in terms of what's driving that. It's information asymmetries in the system. It's unfounded risk perception that women are less risky. The mindset of the woman is really important, and actually that capability to go in and pitch and be able to actually have that ability to convince the financier, even though we know that women in the long run are a better and safer bet. There are legal constraints, as we've heard, and that also, how can we start thinking about how we reshape the financial system, particularly this issue about having collateral, and that becomes more acute in developing countries as well, in global south, in emerging markets as well. So legal constraints, women, I think it's around 170 countries out of 190 have legal barriers to women's economic empowerment. So that's the sort of systemic scale. I think also one that we maybe will explore a bit more late in depth, and I think we were touching on this idea, is around social norms. There's a lot of barriers. One of the areas we're very focused on, we will look at this in FCDO from a systemic approach to how, which I'll come back to, but unpaid care work, for example. My colleague Grace prepared some statistics for me, and this one was absolutely astounding. So women and girls daily provide 160 million hours more unpaid care work than their male counterparts. Now, you translate that into time poverty, that is time that they cannot put into a business or even into their employment. And this is across the globe. This is not just a specific piece. And just coming back to this universality question, it was in 2016, there was the Rose Review in the UK that found that women entrepreneurs got 1% of VC funding. So this is a systemic issue globally, and fixing it is important for global reasons, as I've set out. So I think it's basically we need to take, based on the evidence and on data-driven approaches, but I think also heavily contextualized as well. So it will depend on context, having a sort of complex set of approaches. And so our approach is we are looking to how do we increase access to finance? How do you fix the global financial system to get rid of these inherent biases? And I think there's some really, even just a simple thing, that evaluation framework, the impact that could have. It doesn't have to be, as Anadi was setting out, it doesn't have to be big sort of financing vehicles, etc. So that's really important. But how do you support women entrepreneurs? We have within FCDO, under one of our programs, the WAVTech program, which is detailed mentoring for women-owned businesses in the tech sector to go and pitch for finance. That's really important. But I'd really also like to touch on that point about then how do you, we tend to find women can be over-mentored and underfunded. So how do you bring the two together? And particularly, I think such a crucial point about this growth stage business. So how do you get that growth? So women come out of those more marginal, sort of low profit areas and start to scale businesses that, as we said at the start, can create employment. And then how do you get the sort of social systems in place and start changing some of the social norms, which I think we'll come on to talk about. But so yeah, so true, it's both, I think, and you have to come up the problem, and it is about having catalytic systemic interventions, but I think it's realizing it's also a global problem, and it's also going to require that sort of a multiplicity of resources and interventions. So how do we start to coordinate those? And I think that is where the data and the research and the evidence is absolutely critical.
Right. So building on some of these points, so the language of entrepreneurship, scaling, disrupting, capturing market share, is all kind of borrowed from the world of venture capital. And those models tend to be based having a very specific type of funder in mind. So as Ademola was mentioning, women often start businesses not to scale and not to grow, but just as to have a stable source of income. It's to build resilience, is to navigate the lack of formal employment. So on the other hand, both of you have mentioned the importance of addressing this issue of scale and growth from the outset. So how do we reconcile this? How can we best approach growth of female-led microenterprises? Should that be our main focus? And if so, how can we best approach it? Perhaps we could start with Ademola on this point.
Okay, so if I was to recommend, or I think the first thing we need to recognize is, for a woman, if she needs to scale a business, I think we need to first start talking about numbers. I repeat it all the time. You cannot scale what you don't measure. And you realize that in many women-owned businesses, we do not take, and I say we because I was in that space a long time ago, we do not take our numbers seriously. So it's, some women don't even know if they are making profits. They don't know like the cost of goods. They don't know all that. So they are running businesses. So I feel like interventions should be more around how do we help this woman know what our numbers are fast so that when she sees the numbers, because the funny thing is when a woman, when then gets to let her woman see her numbers or support her to see her numbers, like they are more likely to be like, no, like, what you mean? Like, I'm not making any profit. Then they are more reactive to how do I then change this? And I've seen it happen all the time where you have entrepreneurs in the room and the first thing they are actually doing their numbers and then I have been running an unprofitable business. No, and beyond the business numbers itself, it's also important that we help them see the numbers of like plan, like long-term plan, because they need to see beyond now. So whatever intervention we are doing, it is important that data is at that central. And unfortunately, data is one of the things that we almost do not have especially in the African region. We almost do not have data because again, there are a lot of limitations to collecting data. You don't go to a woman and ask her, what are your numbers? Like, why do you want to know my numbers? Very defensive and things like that. But it's for male, like they can just tell you their numbers like this, do you have something for me? But a woman like, no, you would, there's just that resistance there. So I think numbers, data needs to be addressed in terms of women-owned businesses. Now, if we get the data part of that right, I think the next thing will of course then be in terms of funding. If we are able to structure their data or their numbers and their books and all that, funding. And when I say funding, I feel like the funding needs to be structured in the way that it actually is going to the growth phase. And how do I mean? I see a lot of interventions in Africa that has to do with we are supporting businesses. And sometimes I'm currently in discussions with some people for a particular training. And, they were talking about budgets for this, budget for that. And I was saying to them that, do you realize that if you have to actually invest in something that can cause transformation, you would have to put a lot of money in that, and time in that intervention. But we see that most of the trainings, maybe the funding comes to typical training institutions, not people that actually understand the problems. And by the time they design curriculums, which is one of the places I try to play, designing of curriculum, they design curriculums that are very shallow, or they import curriculums from a place that is not relevant, forgetting that you are going to implement that curriculum in an environment where you have like different things that play out. So by the time they implement that intervention, we realize that that intervention is not going to cause that transformation we desire. So I feel like and which is where institutions come in. I feel like we need to collect our own data locally, not just like from afar, like collect the data locally so that when we design for that locality, because what works in Netherlands may not work in Egypt, what works in Egypt may not work in Nigeria. So I feel like interventions need to allocate some form of fund to doing the preliminary work of gathering data of people that actually have the problem. Then that data then informs how things are being implemented. That is one way that you can then, oh, this woman, is it just, and I think also the metrics that is being used to define skill. In Africa, if you say a business has $10,000, that's a lot of money. But $10,000 in the UK, it's not money, right? So it means that when we say skill, we need to also define it by region, because 10,000, 100,000 and all that needs to be defined as in that skill. I don't think we should be using a universal metric, honestly, to define skill. But yeah, because what then happens is when you are designing an innovation, I say, oh, growth phase businesses or this thing, and you say that business needs to have $1 million, you will hardly find it in Africa for women-owned businesses. So it means the metrics needs to change in terms of definition. So that is where we need to start from. The metrics, the data, it needs to be fixed per region.
Very good. So Dana, in the part of the world that EBRD works in, how do we teach this growth mentality? How do we enable this focus on scale for women-led microenterprises?
So I think that first I wanted to maybe reflect on the initial questions that you posed about, is it only about growth? Just want to say that for EBRD, majority of the work that we do through financial institutions in emerging markets, which is, we work with about 300 financial institutions from microfinance to banks, we very much focus on the development of SMEs. SMEs are at the different stage of development. Some of them are really nascent, small, micro enterprises. Some of them are indeed going through the growth stage. Some of them might be mature and might need different kind of support. So we don't necessarily focus just on that element where, you know, the businesses might be in that perfect spot where they might be ready for growth, because all of those businesses are part of the economic resilience of the economies where we work. So we would not necessarily differentiate in this space. However, of course, there is more value in providing all the trainings and all the maybe non-financial support as well to businesses which are ahead of that growth stage, of course. So maybe just going back in terms of your next question, how do we support? So I'll just go back to what I mentioned about the Women in Business program that we have, because it's not only about financing. And I really enjoyed what you were saying about the trainings provided, because this is actually part of the Women in Business program that we have. So what we provide is financing, very often accompanied with some first loss risk cover, because as mentioned before, the lack of collateral can make it more difficult for women-led businesses to access finance. But what we also do is we provide non-financial services. So it's in the form of trainings, networking, capacity building for the women-led businesses across different topics. It can be about business planning, it can be about green finance, it can be about digitalization, you name it. But taking into account that these women might need different approach, they might need different channels how we share the information, they need probably dedicated networks where they would feel more comfortable to sharing, etc. So it's not only about finance, it's of course financing is important, but it's also about building the skills. And yes, we absolutely want the businesses to scale, but some of them will remain micro, but they will survive. They will probably survive the next big economic turmoil that might happen in the country and in emerging markets, and in markets in general, actually. These turmoils happen. So it's not only about growth, it's also about increasing resilience through providing training, through providing non-financial services, through providing financing, and also working with the overall ecosystem to, you know, open up new opportunities. And maybe one thing that resonated with me in the previous presentation was also the mention of the focus on export. This is something that, for example, we are exploring now as well. How can women-led businesses be more linked to the export opportunities? And I don't think that there has been enough done in that space to look at that segment specifically.
Claire, focus on survival, resilience, growth, scale.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are many valid sort of reasons we do this, but I think and we have to differentiate between that. So of course there is really valid work that a lot of women are forced to be entrepreneurs because that's their livelihood at that micro. So it's not that every woman who's going to be an entrepreneur is going to have a scalable business. So that provides resilience, it provides a livelihood, and etc. So that is still really important and really valid. I think what the problem it can be though is that women are pushed into that grant space and it can become a trap. So for the reasons that we've just been talking about. So women-owned businesses are much more likely to be sort of financed by grants rather than credit. And it's about this differentiation is really, really important, I think, in terms of how do you differentiate to identify the sort of businesses, and the finance will give the incentive as well. So if you receive credit, exactly the things that Leah was saying, you have to know what your numbers are. You have to invest in your capability to grow your company. So I think there is a risk if we don't have that differentiation, and there isn't that spectrum of finance. all that spectrum of sort of growth models for businesses, recognizing that livelihood support is very valid and is essential, but but then women's enterprises should grow as similarly to men's as well. So how do you make that spectrum of finance available? And that finance will create those incentives as well for those businesses to respond. So that's I think breaking a slight cyclical trap that we can see for women's enterprises remaining small scale and often in marginal low sort of sectors as well, where it's harder to break through. So I think that's the kind of key thing is opening that up, but also giving women the capability to know what to access, how to access, and then to sort of manage that finance and recognize the incentives it creates. I think the other side is it's really important. There was a statistic in the presentation to this, is that women will repay credit. The non-performing loan ratio is much lower for women's businesses. So there is a gap between risk perception with financial institutions and actual risk. And that comes down to the things we've been talking about, which is information asymmetries. It's about probably sort of inbuilt bias about the way that we assess credit risk, etc. So again, that systemically it all has to be sort of addressed, working with women in a very tailored way and focused way, but also looking at that sort of these issues that we're seeing in the financial system, so that you have a spectrum of finance. And that, as I say, that is not to exclude and say we don't focus on livelihood support. It's really important. But what we mustn't say is that can be the only outcome for a women's business. You've done well if it is about getting that scaling and that growth. And then when we look at frontier sectors in the economy, digital, green, the care economy, we would flag again, is so important. There are real opportunities here to start to really address some of these issues, because they're high growth sectors. Some of the barriers that we see can be dismantled. If we're looking at digital finance, we're looking at sort of digital ways to address some of the assessments, etc., collateral, those sorts of things. So, there is an opportunity here. So yes, I think there are very many valid growth models, but I think we've just got to be really careful we don't trap women into a low expectation cycle that is reinforced within the systems that are supporting business growth.
Excellent. Diva, would you like to have some thoughts as well?
Sure, and I think the panel's already covered a lot of ground on this, but I think just to add, I think it's about resilience, it's about growth, it's about all of it. Survival is about all of these things. And I think, we've covered a spectrum of scale of women's enterprises in our conversations and our discussions today, because they're not a monolith, as you're gathering from this conversation. What large scale enterprises need is very different from what ultra poor women need. But I think the most important thing is meeting women where they're at and having programs and policies to be able to help them, regardless of whether you're a micro entrepreneur or you're heading a startup, a tech-based startup, and so on. So to me, I think the useful thing for us to sort of decide is, how do you create that ladder? How do you meet women who are ultra poor, who are potentially in casual wage, high risk jobs, and give them the assets and opportunities, the skilling sort of bundled programs to actually exit the poverty trap and start having their own sort of self-employment or small business? How do you then give them the products, the market linkages, the access to finance that they need to enter women's groups or livelihood collectives to help build their businesses, even if they're not eligible for an individual loan or product? And how do you enable governments to create those models for women to be able to bridge that gap between where they are at and where commercial banks or finance is at, and sort of where is the innovation in countries like Kenya or Ethiopia or Nigeria or India to help do that? And I think that's where a lot of our work is focused, because they're missing sort of gaps where women just don't have access to the things that they need. And when they are in those groups, how do they then, by showing repayment rates within groups, by creating those data trails, by creating sort of alternative ways of determining their credit worthiness, get access to individual credit products or ability to sort of, get into export-oriented industries or have those market linkages. I think the main point I'm trying to make here is women are not a monolith and they're not static. And I think that the most important thing for us to do is to create that sort of ladder where, whatever your goal is, stability, survival, without being stuck in a trap, you are actually meeting women where they're at and have that range of programs and products to get there.
Very good, excellent. So one thing that came up in most of the interventions so far is the importance of data and targeted research. So before we open up for questions, I would like to just ask for your wish list. If you could commission research that would be actionable for development actors and for governments to implement, what would be the key priority and why? So in here it could be, what is the low-hanging fruit that 5 years from now we reconvene and we're all very happy that we understand one of these constraints better and we are able to remove some of these obstacles. Or it could be more long-term research on the fundamentals and the structural barriers that need to be removed. So what would be your wish list? Other in Solo?
Okay, I think top of my wish list would be actually having a research that is focused on the different segments or the different levels of businesses that are owned by women, especially, and I keep saying especially in Africa, because I have, like, my academic background helps me to understand that the hardest place to find data is in Africa. And whatever it is you do going forward, like the decisions we make will be influenced by that data. So if we could, or if we could find research that are very focused and actually first, what Diva said about the ladder. Like, let's first define, okay, in Africa, what does micro mean? In this, what does macro mean? What does medium mean? What does this thing? So if we can segment, if we can first define, if a research based on the region can first establish those definitions, then after the definitions, we then carry out on the ground research. So, and when I say on the ground, so we have a lot of theses, papers that are, they are not on the ground research. They are just like questionnaires that are passed on online to the women that have access to digital. But again, that's just about 5%. Like 95% of them are not even in that region. So it means that we need to have research that actually maybe partnerships. Let's say for instance, is partnering with what University of Lagos, University of Nairobi, to say, okay, you are on the ground. Can we have a collaboration where there's a PhD student, a master's student that is then going to collect data based on what we have defined, meaning we have defined this. So everybody that is earning this amount of money or that is making this amount of money from their business, could you actually go to that kind of woman and collect that data? So we have raw data. One of the things I learned in Singapore at Unleash Global Innovation Lab is the most important thing in your design, in your solution, is the user, is the person that has the problem. So every other thing you design is dependent on the initial person that you collected the data from. Once that data is skewed, every other thing is skewed. So that'll be my wish list. Let's have that maybe collaboration where we can have people collecting data from the actual persons that are affected by these problems. That would be top of my wish list. If I could come back in 5 years and I'm like, oh, instead of saying, oh, that data, Rena said that data was collected from the US, from the business, oh, that data was collected from 30 African countries. Like, I think that would be something that I'll be really happy about.
Transformative, very good. Dana, your wish list?
So for me, because my focus of the work that I do is very much on working with financial institutions, for me, it would be to understand a bit better how the portfolios of financial institutions shift over time as a result of different interventions. Mm-hmm. Because of course, it's nice to have dedicated programs to support women-led businesses, but what we want to change the system, right? So we want to see how the financial institutions are actually shifting their portfolio towards the women-led businesses that are operating and are lacking funding in the market. We have done this, for example, we have done some analysis on our program in Turkey, for example. So there are some results specifically for Turkey, but it would be interesting to see how maybe even the soft measures can soft measures, not necessarily result of introducing new women in business program, but maybe when a bank introduces certain training, what happened to the uptake, sort of looking at what are those most impactful activities in different markets under different conditions. So I think it's done sort of ad hoc, research is available, but maybe having more systematic approach. Okay, so this kind of country, this kind of interventions yielded the best results. And at the moment, we don't have this.
Right. Claire?
Strap in, Larry. I'm joking. There's a lot. I mean, I completely agree with both of those, but just to add, I think looking at it's quite under research is around the impact of social norms and on women's economic empowerment and understanding that and what are the levers you can pull. That's a more complex issue and how do you address that? It's not necessarily with big funded interventions or those sorts of approaches, but what are the ways? And we have examples within our work where we are seeing. So for example, we partnered with Twinings with one of our programs, the WOW program, that worked with women tea farmers and male tea farmers. We did a radio show, reached 120,000 women and 180,000 men on why men should take more responsibility for care and how that will improve the household income and the resilience of what is a joint enterprise. So that's at one end of the scale. And then BII, which is our development institution, it looked at board membership across Africa. So go right the other, and it found only 14% of boards across Africa had with female representation. So then they could tailor that, but you have to understand what's driving that, and it's highly contextualized. So I think that's a sort of key area for us, and understanding if we addressed the big issue of the care burden on women and the time poverty that creates, what impact would that have? And I think that's a global issue when you look at that, and particularly with demographics. We've got an aging population in the north and we've got a very young population in the south. How is that going to impact? I will stop before I say we've got big shifts. We've talked about climate, we've talked about demography. Demography. We've also got this big AI revolution coming. So are we prepared for that, to understand how it's going to impact women as a positive and as an opportunity, but also potentially as a risk, similarly with climate and demographics. So I think those are some of the areas. I think just two others were made. I think we touched on this. I think the ladder analogy is just brilliant. It's around this intersectional vulnerabilities. There isn't one type of women. You've got women working in fragile and conflict-threatened states or in advanced economies. They may have disability or whatever, but looking at that sort of intersectionality as well is really, really quite key. I think just one challenge I'd like to spot out in the research, research isn't gender neutral either. So I think we've also got to look at how we do the research and think about that paradox. Are there inbuilt biases that are in the research itself? So really looking at how we do research to make sure that we're not looking at those unconscious biases, and why it's absolutely critical that this is contextual and locally led, making sure that we don't inbuild that one, particularly from my world, talking to policymakers. You're often talking to male policymakers. So, and then they say, well, we want research on this. So how can you make sure that where there might be sort of inbuilt unconscious biases there, that then doesn't reflect how we work with that partner at a country level, at a policymaker level as well. So I think thinking that through as well is also quite important.
Excellent. Thanks, Claire. Sandeetha?
Very, very long wish list. Okay. Really good I went last because the panelists have covered a lot of it. But I can add to some of what I think is also going to be very useful. One of the things that we are interested in looking at over the next year is actually thinking about the impact of wholesale financing all the way down to women's enterprises. So really understanding, whether the kind of sort of new financing mechanisms that are existing, that are trying to channel funds to women's enterprises, what actual impact they have, in terms of the sort of entrepreneurship statistics that you see. The other thing that I think is on the sort of financial institutions front is there's a lot of scope for innovation. And I think that there's so much happening right now, and the research industry needs to, catch up, in fact, with the innovation that's going on and, sort of develop more of those partnerships. And it can be incredibly tricky, right? So unlike the global health space, where a lot of organizations are so in tune with working with researchers, it's not like financial institutions are always open or always know how to work on RCTs or can like randomize their product design. So, but I do think that's a frontier in terms of actually cracking those collaborations between financial institutions and the research community. I also think that there's a lot to understand about trajectories from women who are moving from extreme poverty and sort of micro enterprises to sort of small enterprises and large ones. So if you think about some of the partners that IGC has, like BRAC, for example, they've been in this business for over 20 years. They've seen women actually do those journeys in terms of going from different kinds of enterprise sizes. And I think actually trying to understand those trajectories better with the data, which is also a wish list, would be really nice to do.
Thank
And
you.
yeah, sorry, I know where I'm.
No, thank you so much. We're running out of time, but I would still probably collect one or two questions. If you don't get a chance to ask your question, we will continue the conversation outside with some refreshments for about 15-20 more minutes. So if there are any pressing questions that we could collect now, if you could please just identify yourself, ask the question, and perhaps direct it to one of the panelists. There's one in the back. I think there's some roving microphones. Yes. Again, we can collect a couple of questions. Another one. Hi, everyone. My name is Sorry, it may not be working.
Use this one.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. My name is Felicia Sigrist. I'm from WeFi, the Women Entrepreneurs Finance Initiative. Thanks so much to IGC for organizing this excellent event and to the panelists for your interesting insights. I just quickly wanted to reflect on 3 points. First, the importance of data leadership and collective action to drive a systemic change in the financial sector. And we heard from the panelists that individual interventions won't be enough, but we really need to shift mindsets, behaviors, and systems in financial intermediaries, banks, funds, and others to increase financing for women entrepreneurs. And here data can help make the business case, but we also need leadership commitments from high-level leaders in those institutions to really shift the needle. And the Refinance Code, which has been mentioned as well, brings all these elements together and provides catalytic value to tackle those like structural barriers. The second point is on better connecting data, research, and policy dialogue. So new data will help fill the evidence gaps, but then evidence must also be used for program design and policy making, right? And knowledge exchange through events like this one is also really important to reach scale and replication and innovation across the ecosystem. And then the last point, just very quickly, we not only need to tackle structural barriers in the economy, but also in society and in our homes. Social norms, as we've heard, still play an important role in many contexts, including caregiving, and women are mostly still seen as the default caregivers. So WeFi, we are very looking forward, and we are proud that our governing committee has approved new funding to support women care entrepreneurs, also with generous contributions from the UK and other donors. So we believe women entrepreneurs can be real catalysts for building a strong care economy. and here goes my question, sorry. So a bit like linking to the issue of social norms and systemic change as well. How do we make sure our messaging gets into non-traditional spaces as well? And how can we engage more men and boys in those conversations as well?
Excellent, thank you. Is there any other quick question? Oh, I see one quick one here in the front.
Hello, my name's Sibylla Din. We have a consultancy that works in the space of actually mobilizing gender contribution to economic growth, and our vision is quite straightforward. We'd like to help economies and banks unlock the 30% contribution that women can make to GDP. Rather than a question, I'd like to put forward two observations we found through the work. By the way, we've worked in 30 countries and we've been going for 20 years. Claire, you sort of alluded to it, so it's not directed at you, but I'd like to pick up on the thought, which is, do we need a different type of financial institution to fund female SMEs? Because commercial banks, the way they are organized, they're organized to fund large businesses. So just that's my observation. I'd welcome some thoughts. My other observation in working across these markets, particularly in Africa, where we've done a lot of work, is that to scale women businesses, we really need to look at the missing middle. The missing middle is too large to be funded by the micro institutions and too small to be funded by commercial banks. So those are my observations. It's open for debate. The final point, because I have been challenged on it by myself, by clients, is do we think that women need special financial products? Like most of you, I've been standing on the stage and saying we should develop needs-led financial products till I was challenged by a person in the room saying a loan is a loan, a saving is a saving. So 3 observations, would love your feedback on it.
Thank you very much. So I would summarize with, how do we teach social norms in this space? Do we need new financial institutions and new financial products as well? So if you could quickly give your reactions, it can, who would like to tackle?
I can start maybe on the
So the missing middle, the missing middle as well.
The missing middle as well. So maybe first reaction on the social norms and how do we get people engaged in the discussion. So again, from the perspective of our work with financial institutions, but also with companies, we have recently developed an instrument which is called Care Compass, and it basically helps a business to assess how their provision for care looks like. Do they have flexible working hours? Do they have, I don't know, childcare provision? What are those activities that they can take? And I think that that's again a first step in conversation, because it puts value on what is being done. Because otherwise, care is unspoken of. They say, oh yeah, someone has to leave because they have a little child, but it sort of systemizes the discussion and clearly points out what a business can do for everybody to participate better in economy. So I think that there's, again, no simple solution, but starting the conversation and helping the businesses to identify what can be done differently is very important.
I'm very, very sorry to interrupt you. I really do apologize. It's just that we're being told that we have to leave the room. I'm really sorry to interrupt the conversations. We do have an hour or so for networking outside. I'm really sorry. I'm being told that we have to begin to end the event. We've got the room booked until 4, but the outside reception area for an hour. So continue to ask your questions. I'm really sorry to interrupt.
No, thanks so much, Anna. So I just left with thanking our excellent panel for sharing this insightful conversation, and thanks everyone for the questions as well.
Yeah, it's for Turkish market. It's really because